race and gender as we know it today were a product of the history of conquest and colonization.
So, you're Professor Rita Segato, you're a writer, anthropologist, feminist activist, and a human rights advocate. So, about this, my first question for you is, how are anthropology and activism related, and how do they support each other?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Lately, in one of my last books, I speak about a responsive anthropology in English, or an anthropology on demand, in which the anthropologist, more than putting questions, answers questions of the people. So I realized that I have been practicing that responsive anthropology for a long time. For example, all my studies, research on violence against women, that was never something decided by myself. It was a question put to my president of my university by the police of the city I was living for a long time in Brasilia. So the chief of security in town came to the university and asked my president of the UNB, which is the name of the University of Brasilia, to answer why there was a kind of an amount of rapes in the city that he couldn't understand suddenly. I mean, suddenly the number of rapes was increased. So asked the president to answer that question. And so I, as an anthropologist, was one of the professors who had to answer that question. So from that on, I started to practice an anthropology that answers with the knowledge, I mean, of the method, methodology, ethnography, ethnographic method, and answers questions more than put questions. I mean, put questions that were in order to answer the people what the people need to know.
Another question that I had was, what are the similarities and differences between the 20th and the 21st century feminism? Because it has been discussed like how activism has become much widespread but less effective due to work on social media. So
no,
it's not
I
like
don't believe
you don't
that
believe
at
so.
all.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
I can tell you the answer for that. You have to look for it among the conservative, reactionary, and the parties that support accumulation and concentration. Because the confluence of all that political parties into restraining and repressing and censoring women's reivindications is the proof of how much we have walked, how much we have got for the world. I mean, in different words, how much we menace the powers.
That's very beautiful, because sometimes it can be a little bit challenging to hear that it's become just something
they are
for
telling
show.
They are telling us that we put in risk their power.
Oh, that's such a great view on this. I love it.
I believe so.
Another question that I had was, you have underlined many times the importance of language and the use of the correct language, especially on day-to-day. So my question is, why is it so important to use the correct words? And linked to this, so why is it so important, like for example, the word feminicide that you've talked about in femminicidio y femminicidio. So the differences, and why is it so important that this word does not get erased? Because many have to, like for example, Milei has talked to eliminate the word because it's not like useful. So why do you think
naming
so?
is fundamental. I mean, if you don't have any other means to do politics, the politics of naming is very, very strong. I think I am the proof for that, because when you name something, that name becomes a tool.
Yeah, it becomes real through the name.
And you can, yes, it's like a mirror. The name is like a mirror. You can realize something, for example, a pain that you shouldn't be suffering, a problem that is in society, but if you haven't the rhetoric, if you haven't got the name, you cannot fight against that. Or you cannot fight to keep something that is useful. For example, which I speak a lot about lately, the feminine politicity. I mean, there is a politicity, a way of administration that comes from the history of women that it lost the name. Feminine style administration lost the name and is not considered politics anymore.
And what were the effects due to the loss of this?
That you don't realize that we may have another way of doing politics and solving problems.
So it's just like the traditional male?
No, it's because everything was captured by the state. So the scene of the state, civil society, of the public scene, sort of kidnapped all what is considered political. Lately, I propose as another way to politics.
Mm-hmm. And that was also a response to what has surrounded you in the last years. This research was in response of how politics has changed in the last years?
I speak about, in Spanish, is la política, o sea, the political and lo político, politics itself. And I believe they are not the same.
Okay. And how do they differentiate themselves?
That's
In a very much...
Because the political goes towards power, parties, syndicates, trade unions, social movements. There is an author which I learned a lot from him, a Peruvian thinker called Aníbal Quijano. He used to say, it's not the issue of the social movement, it is the issue of the movement of society, which is different. Because I think even social movements, which are very important, parties, trade unions, are sort of kidnapped by the idea of power. And for me, power is a bad word.
Your work are based on women, but especially the link between gender, colonialism, and racism. So my question is about more your methodology. So why is intersectionalism the best approach to study? Why do we need to see the picture as a whole? Because sometimes seeing just gender does not give us the complete picture.
Yeah. The idea is, what we have to think is about power. And for example, the study of gender, in fact, is the study of power in its sort of more basic moment, which is the gender formation. It's power. Race is power too. So they are really two aspects of power which are very, very important in history. And for us, from the decolonial perspective, which is quite not easy to understand, race and gender as we know it today were a product of the history of conquest and colonization. Because race is the attribution of another biology, of another organism to the defeated in the conquest process. And gender becomes the same, becomes biologicized which wasn't before conquest. I mean, the biological determination of gender is a consequence of conquest and colonization. Before, you had much more transitivity. We believe that transitivity in gender is an invention of the present, and it's not, because pre-colonial societies had much more transitivity in gender. I mean, biology was not so determinant as it becomes after the invention of race.
Exactly. That was one of the questions that I had for later on. Yeah, because how gender fluidity has been recognized in much ancient times, like for example, indigenous
wasn't a problem
society.
as it
so
is today.
Why is the need for this dichotomy, this difference, like you said, the transition?
Binarism.
The binarism.
Yeah, I speak about the patriarchy in pre-colonial times as hierarchical. I believe there was a kind of patriarchy, which I call dualism. Dualism as a variety of pluralism. You have two categories of people, but each of them with its own politicity, with its own way of administration of life. And after colony, you have a binary society. The center, the subject, the complete subject of politics, which is male, white, owns property, is letrado, is literate, more than alphabetized, and feminism traditionally calls it heterosexual, and I don't say that, because about his sexuality we don't know nothing. We know nothing about the sexuality of males, or we know very little. I say he is pater familias.
Okay.
You understand?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and that captures all what is plainly, completely political. And we women remain as completely depoliticized. And if you want to have a discourse which is completely political, you have to enunciate it from the space which is plainly political, which is the state of the civil society. You have expropriated all the other spaces from their politicity.
I think you explained it very clearly. Despite the lack of time, you explained it very clearly. And another thing that I read on your work was the term privatization of sexuality. Also, I think it was in
the family.
Yes. So
not sexuality. No, about sexuality, I say in one of the chapters of the book, The Critique of Coloniality.
I think so,
it's a chapter called The Sex and the Norm. And I say that the indigenous people, which are called tribal people, the people who live in the structure of communality, they don't have the pornographic eye, which is the eye to things. I mean, the pornographic eye is described, defined in that text as the eye towards, is a refined, a commodifying eye to something which is dead, or is being killed. It's very difficult to explain it now. So the people don't have that look at life like thing, appropriable. You cannot commodify nature. You cannot commodify which is alive. So you can only commodify and transform in property which is dead. What is reified, what is dead, what is a thing. The best way of calling it is thingified. Cosificable. This word exists in Spanish, but it doesn't exist in English. In English, you can say commodify, reify, but not thingify.
Thingified, so it becomes a thing, something you can...
Yeah, and the pornographic eye looks at something which is being commodified, reified, thingified, I think.
Thank you so much. I think, I don't know,
And
but...
in this text, Sex and the Norm, I tell two stories of indigenous people in Brazil which show the difference of their way of looking at sex and the Western way of looking at sex. I give two examples of that.
And what were the differences that you found in this?
No, that is it's
too long. Thank you so much for coming here. It was so interesting.
Thank you. I have a great difficulty for speaking in English in an Italian environment because I am Italian, but I cannot speak the language. So it's a contradiction in my mind.
Maybe next time.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you.